America began as an act of violence. America as a nation is rooted in violence, which is one of the reasons why it is one of the most violent nations on earth, whether you're talking about black or white. You see? As I said earlier, don't let that Constitution fool you and all of this democracy stuff talk and deceive you. What are its origins? The origins of America are criminal. And it therefore is what I call a crimogenic society, in that it breeds criminality because it is rooted in criminality. Why are you surprised? What are the two major acts of criminality that brought this country into being? The first one, of course, is what? The criminal destruction of Indian nations. Rape and robbery and thievery. Taking of lands and taking of wealth. Destroying of people's cultures and nations. Placing people in prisons called reservations. Slandering their culture and their character as people. This country is built on it. I don't give a hoot whether you love it or not. It's what it's built on, and that's the reality of it. And why can I call it a crime? Because I can call it a crime based on the white folks themselves. They came over here with the Bible in their hand, didn't they? They came over here touting something called the golden rule, didn't they? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Okay, so don't tell me they didn't know any better. They would not have had that done to themselves. And yet they did it to others. And so within the context of their own cultural definitions, and within the context of their own religion, they were criminal. Okay? And we have to face that. Of course, the next major crime was the enslavement of African people, was the destruction of African civilizations. You talk about the disruption of the black family, as if that disruption occurred since the 1960s and 70s. The disruption of the African family began with slavery. That's where it started. And the disruption of African culture, the disruption of social relations and arrangements and institutions of African people began with slavery, and it has not stopped yet. And yet millions of our people died in this process and were killed in this process. And we have an endless history of death, damnation, and destruction. The coercion of our people into work, a slandering of our culture, and a slandering of our character, the lynching of our people, the physical abuse of our people, the racial discrimination against our people. All of these things with which we are familiar have been practiced from day one in this country. And these practices are criminal. And therefore America is rooted in this criminality. But see, America won't face this reality. And many of us won't face it. And we won't come to terms with it. And yet, we go to these churches and we talk every day about the fact that people are not saved unless they what? Repent of their sins. Yes. Repent. The old rich man ran to Jesus and said, "What must I do to be saved?" "Give your money back to the poor, you thief." He didn't do it, though, did he? But that was the thing. Look, you got to give it up. You got to give it back. You got to repent. You got to admit. But you see, we as black people want to put that rule on ourselves, but we don't demand it on those who misused us. And if they do not reparate, and if they do not repent, if they do not come to terms with the sins enumerated by their own book, the book that they laid on us, then they will suffer, and as they suffer, we will suffer. I'm telling you. But we don't want to deal with that. See, we want somehow God to overlook white folk. You see, it ain't going to happen. We think somewhere down the road these whites are going to really share something with us. I tell people this. That thing is very interesting. The rich man runs says, "What should I do to be saved?" And he says, "Give the money back to the poor, you know." Joker ran out. And I said, "Look, if you think that Jesus is God, isn't it interesting that this man looks God right in the face? He says it ain't happening." Okay? And Jesus says he got as much of a chance of getting into heaven as a camel through the eye of a needle, right? I say that for you people who sit around here thinking one day good news is going to strike this white man's heart. And he's going to share equally his wealth and power with you just out of the goodwill and goodness of his mind. If he can look your God, if the rich man can look God in the face and say no, you know doggone well, then these folk can look you in the face and going to say no. So you got to figure another way of dealing with it, another way of approaching it. You may as well give up waiting for that great day when somewhere this white is going to find it is hard to share what he has with you. That's why you got to study power. You got to take it. Yeah. And this violence perpetrated by whites, it was not, again, just violence, random violence. Always when you have violence, you have a mythology that rationalizes and justifies what you're doing, you see. And it's interesting to look at mythologies. The mythology of conflict resolution that they have. And that mythology is a part of America even today. How do you resolve conflict? Take it out and shoot them. Where did we get that from? Frontier justice. You're right in the middle of it. The old Western mythologies. You know, people have never really stopped to study how much violence really went on in the West. You'd be surprised. Not nearly as much as you think. Nah, you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised at how much lying has gone on about the cowboy and the, and all that stuff. In fact, it's interesting if you read some of you may be familiar with the current struggle going on over Sam Houston, right? Since you're here in Texas, huh? Somebody wants to build a statue for him somewhere out there. Then there's another group that says, no, not for that old drunkard. He was a drunkard, And it's, a drunken sod came right into Texas here trying to be big man. Sorry to dump on your land here. Ne'er-do-well looking for a new opportunity in the land of Texas. A bad general, too. Running like hell from Santa Ana and the other people there. Oh yeah, check the real history out. You see? Now you got your fourth largest city in the country or whatever, named after Sam Houston, but you haven't really studied who Sam Houston was. What a rascal he was. How he was not really thought well of by many people. How the battle he won was more by accident than it was by design and plan. Yeah. The whole bit. All kinds of myths have been generated to what? To justify this nation. So the myth of the chosen, that these people were chosen by God in some way to rule the earth. The myth of what it means to be a man, you see. All of these kinds of myths have become a part of American folklore, but they're just not folklore. They become a part of people's ways of behaving and relating to other people. A real man don't take no stuff. You know, and he or she dissed me, you know. And how do you resolve that? You know, you go for it. Because that's what? The American way of solving problems. You see? And there's a mythology there. People not only dominate other people, they rationalize that domination. They make an excuse for dominating other people. So the whites had to rationalize their immoral behavior that was even condemned by their own Bible and by their own God. They had to rationalize the murder of Indians and the enslavement of black folk. And in order to rationalize it then, they had to create a racial mythology that we were born to be slaves. You see. So they're not doing anything wrong. This is right in line with God's plan. They brushed off that old dusty myth of Ham to try to convince themselves and us that somehow in the divine order of things, we were designed to be the servants of others. And yet even the reading of that thing itself does not say that at all. But people believe it because it's a part of the racial mythology that has been laid down, you see. And so many of us are willing to forgive those other people for what they've done and ask nothing from them because in a sense we've subconsciously internalized these kind of mythologies, you see, that somehow we are people who are supposed to be the servants of other people. And that's one of the reasons why we think that they're going to be exempted from the law. The Indians were destroyed because they were what? Savages. Okay? They're the savages. They're the ones without civilization. They fed you when you got in, would have starved to death, maintained the white colonies and so forth. And what thanks did they get for it? Death. Why? Because they were savages. So again, what do you got? Oppression. Things being done what? Turned around. Turned backwards. You see, the victim is made to appear to be the perpetrator. You see, and this is what mythology does. Mythology seeks to what we call naturalize history. To make what is appear to be what is natural, or what has been divinely ordained by some natural order, or by some divine order. And so we get a mythology. Not only though do people build a mythology to justify what they're into, they act in terms of the mythologies that they develop. The mythology of racism and the mythology that was built around black people is used to justify segregation, justify discrimination, justify all forms of misbehavior toward us as a people. Once you use that mythology and use the mythology to create an environment, you actually then begin to create behavior as a result of placing the person in a particular environment, you see. And this is what happens. You put people in a particular environment, after a while, that environment is reflected in their behavior. You put a person in prison, you keep them in prison, they learn to be criminal. Yes, and we know prisons are schools for criminality. But you see, the process of putting them in is overlooked. The process of creating the environment is overlooked. What you do is count noses after you've done it. You say, oh, well, you know, so many of them are arrested for violence. That means they must be violent. But the whole process of how it happened is not dealt with. I deal with something in black on black violence I call the structuration of crime. What am I trying to say there? Simply because a man mugs someone else doesn't mean he's more criminal than a man who swindles, even though we are often convinced of that. Often crime is not irrational, but a rational process. People weigh, they weigh all kinds of options often when they engage in crime. When you've robbed a person of education, you've robbed them of job opportunities and possibilities, locked them in what amounts to reservations. If they had the same level of criminality as a person who has a degree in accounting, works as a vice president of a bank, they're going to create two different sorts of crimes, not because one is more criminal than the other, but because of the structure in which they both reside. As I've said before, it's crazy if you are an accountant and you have control of the money and you can electronically transfer millions of dollars to your own account for you to go out in the street and knock somebody in the head for a few nickels. You have what? Different options. Not that you're necessarily less criminal. Your object is the same, to do what? Get money. You look at your options. So, hey, man, I can transfer this, doop, 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 doop. I got $1 million, I'm done with it. But another man who's not what? Sitting at that position, is not in that place, looks at his options. Well, I either got to break into a house, knock somebody in the head, one way or the other, you see. And yet we don't talk about, you see, how so-called black-on-black violence and the criminality in our community is structured by the very system itself. You see, how placing and restrict our people under certain circumstances and restricting their options, we literally dictate the types of crime that they will commit when they commit them. And then we want to talk about their violent nature and try to connect it with their genes. See, when these whites were begging and poor and weak over here in this country, they didn't hesitate to kill and mug the Indians, did they? To rape and rob and steal and do whatever they could. Once they got it under control and passed their mafia rules, they didn't have to engage in that anymore. They used their army and police force and other kind of things to do that. And then they can look like they are less violent and less, this and that. Why? Because they're less criminal? No. Because their options are different. You see? And in a way, then, if we to change the nature of so-called criminality, I tell people, look, you want us to get out of violent crime? Let us become accountants. We'll just run a good SNL scandal on you, but we won't hit anybody in the head, won't shoot anybody. But it's very important for us to understand, as we got to rush through here. But we got to look at these kind of things, you see, before we just jump up and make moral condemnations and make psychological condemnations of people and other kind of things. That's why, you see, you got to be African-centered in your education so that you can perform the right kind of analyses and things. But when you let other people teach your children, you let other people teach you, they're going to teach you and educate you into ignorance and into stupidity, I'm telling you. And into blindness and distort your perception capacity to see what is going on. And you join with them in condemning yourself and your children, you see. And you will think that the only thing that needs to be changed is some kind of moral relationship here, an outcome. No, there are political and social and economic changes that must occur if we have to change things here. So to a great extent, the crime that's created in this world is created as a result, particularly in terms of the so-called black community, of the structuring of this society by white domination and the mythology that it projects to justify that domination. Most of all, it's structured by the whites' denial of their own criminality and their own criminal behavior, and their projecting of their own criminality onto their victims. So the Indians become the savages, even though they were minding their business before you got here. They were alive, they had their nations. But now you say that they were killed because they were savages. You see, so the whole thing gets turned around. Tremendous psychic violence, which I think is even worse than physical violence, was visited on our people. We don't have time to talk about this today. Why do we think of black people anyway as more criminal? Let's look quickly at this game and see how it's played, this projecting of criminality. The political paradox is, as stated in the Wall Street Journal in August 1992, people with the least to fear from crime drive the crime issue. Appeals to suburban whites highlight split between perception and reality. In other words, people who are least threatened by crime are the first one to talk about it. And the people who are less threatened directly by crime are the first people that the politicians talk to and generate fear in about crime. You had Clinton talking about the hiring 100,000 police officers. And yet, the perception of crime and the public's perception of crime and the reality of crime remain far apart. In 1990, whites committed 54% of all violent crimes, while blacks committed 45%. The rate of increase in the incidence of violent crime over the past decade has been the same among blacks and whites. But why do we get this image of black folk as being the criminal folk? You see? Moreover, violent crimes between races are by far the exception. Black people are not out here wholesalely attacking white folk. Black folk are victimized more by other black folk than by anyone else, and so are white folk. In 1998, 92% of violent crimes committed against whites were committed by other whites, while 84% of violent crimes committed against blacks were committed by other blacks. So why do we get this image here of some black folks stalking in the shadows, looking to victimize white folk more than they victimize themselves? Why is crime even talked about with that image anyway, you see? You must recognize then that there's a political game going on here, a psychological game, a mythology being created, a managing of image to justify domination, a managing of image to justify unemployment and to justify locking people in inner city reservations and to justify the continued control of the lives of African people by non-African people, going against the very facts that these people themselves collect, you see, and know better. And while and we look at a couple of other things here, the American Medical Association published around in June 1992 a battery of some 70 studies indicating that the greatest increase in gunshot deaths has been among white men and women in large and small cities, with black men and for black men in small cities. Among white men and women in inner city, that is, violence among white men and women in the inner cities rose by about 30%, slightly more than blacks. So where do we get this image here then, that blacks are in the vanguard of criminality in this country? And why do we, as black people, buy this? Doesn't mean that we are not engaged in violence to police, I'm not saying that. But why is it that we have this one side image? TV is promoting this perception. Why do we have the image of the white woman as being victimized by the hulking black man, when a recent study indicates it found that women of any age were far less likely to be victimized and the victims of crime than men? In fact, black males are by far the most frequent victims of violence. For every 1,000 black males over the age of 12, 53 have been victims of a violent crime. That compares with 35 white males, 28.2 black females, and 21.3 white females. But yet we get this image of Miss Helpless, being brutalized and overrun by black men. We have to face what's going on here. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a game being played on the minds of our people, a game that is used to justify violence. I wish I had time. We don't have time to talk about the increasing violence in white suburban schools that's occurring, and the increasing violence occurring in white rural schools of places like Dartmouth, Massachusetts, where white boys walked into the classroom with a bat and knife and everything, walked directly into the class while the teacher's teaching to stab another student to death. And they say, oh, we thought this only happened in the inner city. Well, it's happening all over because America is a violent society on the whole, you see, and this violence is around, but we don't hear much about that. When we talk about violence, as I said earlier, why do we look at ourselves only? A few instances of how whites rationalize their control and how they project their criminality on other people, I think, can be illustrated by the following set of facts. That white males are arrested more. Whites are arrested more for violent crimes, including murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault than blacks. More arrested for property crime, including burglary, larceny, motor vehicle, theft, and arson. More arrested for drug abuse violation, weapons carrying, possessions, forgery, and counterfeiting. Offenses against family and children. Most sex offenses, driving under the influence, disorderly conduct, liquor laws, and runaways. How do we get this image then of the black criminal man as being what it is today? I cannot fail to mention the crimes of the white male against black humanity in the forms of wars of conquest, colonization, and ongoing oppression, of wars using African puppet proxy armies and white and black terrorists and mercenaries, repressing neo-colonial governments against African populations. These war crimes perpetrated by the white male have produced murdered casualties and maimings in the millions. If you read a current book by Brzezinski, who I think was Secretary of State or something under Nixon or so forth, he has a book now, let's see, in fact there are two out now. One, Pandemonium, I believe, I may have it mixed up, that's written by Moynihan, and I forget the name of the one that is written by Brzezinski. These people are coming face to face with the fact that we are not facing a new world order, we are facing a new world disorder. And they're coming face to face with the fact that ethnicity is not going away. It never went away and it ain't going nowhere. And that a serious mistake is overlooked, is made when you do not deal with ethnicity and with religious philosophy and so forth. When you look around the world, this is what you see. This is what's happening in the world. And now they're trying to deal with it. Brzezinski, I think, makes the statement that in the 20th century, essentially, these Europeans have perpetrated the death of 167 million people. And I said earlier that, why are we looking at the African American gang member trying to study him in terms of genetics and crime? Despite all of this, the media has successfully created and maintained an image of Africans, particularly African American males, as the greatest menace to life and limb. I have to sum it up here, but this is the kind of cultural context in which black on black violence takes. And we have to look at it within that context. This violence has created a lot of the violence that we see today. Alienation, and created the emotions, alienations, anger, hypersensitivity, inferiority complex, which becomes a source of much misbehavior, including violent behavior. This constant propaganda about our people being a criminal people, about the black male being a criminal person, about black people being inferior and so forth, has been internalized by too many of us. And once we internalize that racism, we act toward each other as a white racist would act toward each other. I've indicated to a great extent the black-on-black criminal is essentially a white racist in black clothing. Because what? He feels and has the same attitude toward his fellow black that a white racist has. We don't have time today to talk about the role of identity and what identity means and what consciousness means, you see. But then you can hear, if you ride the subways in New York City, you can hear our young men using the same words that we here in the South would never have used in public. And we would never have allowed ourselves to use in public, you see. But people who now have identified and have with whites and have internalized their attitudes, the same attitudes that whites have internalized toward us, then feel quite free to engage in violence. We have to look at adolescence, the whole issues of adolescence, when people are struggling for power, when young people are struggling with frustration, when they're trying to struggle with their ethnic and sexual identity, when they're trying to gain peer acceptance, when they're concerned with status symbols, boredom, norms, and so forth, and how that feeds into the so-called violence that we're talking about as a people. And what have we done to deal with the crisis of adolescence? A quick look then at what I call the ecological context of violence. A recent study was done here in New York demonstrating that 75% of those in prison were generated from 7 neighborhoods in New York City. And all of from all over the state, 7 neighborhoods generated about 75% of the prisoners in prison there, indicating that there's something about the ecology of those neighborhoods. There's something happening in those neighborhoods generating a criminality. And of course, you know, I don't have to name the names, Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brownville, and other names which are very familiar to us. What is going on in those places? You see, violence that begets violence is facilitated when there are no mitigating influences. That is, influences that stand between the person and violence. In other words, if we had a correct ethnic history, a correct ethnic culture, and knowledge of ourselves and ethnic consciousness, if we had appropriate educational institutions, if our family compositions were what they should be, if our employment and incomes were what they should be, then violence would be reduced in our communities. You see, what we call social institutions are not things people just happen to create. Social institutions are instruments created by people to deal with reality, to protect them, to provide for them, to serve as a power against reality and the power over reality to control reality, you see. We know then that people who generally receive certain levels of education, types of education and so forth, tend to engage in violent behavior less, at least the kind that we're talking about here today. People who have been raised in certain types of family situations tend to produce less violence than others. People who have been socialized in appropriate spiritual institutions tend to be less violent in their orientation than others. people whose household and levels of health and so forth exist tend to produce less violence than other people, you see. But you have a trick that has gone on in this country. At the same time, we have been attacked in terms of psychic violence by those who rule over us, those who've slandered our culture, and those who've slandered us as people. These same people have also destroyed the social institutions that we could have used to mitigate and reduce the effects of their violence against us as people, you see. So you get a double whammy. It's like when we used to get punished as a kid, somebody get ready to hit you, and you hold up your hand and they tell you to do what? Take your hand down so I can hit you even harder. You see? So, so it's not so much sometimes a person is perpetrating violence if you're able to do what? Hold your hand up. Hold something up between yourself and what other people are doing to you. You can provide a defense for yourself. But in this system, we have been attacked, and not only are we attacked, the means by which we can defend ourselves against the attack, against our person and against our character and against our psychological well-being and so forth. The means, the income and other means that we could use to mitigate and to change the nature and the results of those attacks against us have also been removed. So this then creates violence. So when you look in these communities where education has been disinvested, where deindustrialization is taken over, where whole industries have moved out of the communities completely, and now they're getting ready to move these industries totally out of the country, ladies and gentlemen. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the effects of deindustrialization. Even those of us who will get jobs and degrees don't have much of a future in America. I'm telling you. If we do not wake up and understand what is going on in this country economically, we're going to be destroyed. We got people out here motivating people. You can be what you want to be. Live your dream. All that kind of stuff. That operates on assumptions, ladies and gentlemen. That operates on the assumption of an expanding economy. That there's increasing what? Job opportunities and increasing possibilities. In the 1960s, the United States economy was expanding, and it had opportunities. Then we could say, if we would only remove racism and job discrimination, we can make it. But that era is over. This was over 30 years ago. In this era now, the removing of racism is not going to enhance the economic possibilities of black people because the jobs are not there. The nature of the economy is changing. Racism is no longer our one and only problem. The global economy is changing in such a way that even if whites remove racism right now, tomorrow, we would still be suffering because the factories are gone. The factories in Detroit that used to provide good livings for black men and women and families that worked in GM and Ford and so forth, that made it possible for them to raise their children, to build decent housing for their children, to send their children to college and everything, are gone. They've disappeared. And this is the kind of world our youngsters live in. The global nature of this economy is getting ready to even destroy white folk if they're not careful. Let alone what's going to happen to us as people. This 40% of the population growth in the United States is being fueled by immigration. You hear what I'm saying? That means other groups are coming in here piling up on top of black folk by the tons. And they're better educated. If you compare, for instance, Koreans and others with blacks, you can see, and Asian with blacks, 46% of the people got college degrees. And we're talking about black people with about 16 or 13%. What are you talking about? These people, and they provide 35% of the people coming into America today. The white man is even hiring people against himself, against his own children. You must understand that today, if you look at the exchange rate between the Russian ruble and United States dollar, it takes almost 600 Russian rubles to equal one United States dollar. What does that mean? That means that the United States can hire now the top physicists and mathematicians in the world for $100 a month. And that's what's happening. That means that they are bringing the Russians over here now. You'll see them in the University of Texas at Austin and other places to teach the physics and the mathematics and so forth. At this point, the unemployment rate for new PhDs, and I'm talking about white folk now, new PhDs in mathematics, chemistry, science, computer science is 13%. And I'm talking about people coming out of MIT, Stanford, and the best white universities because they're being undercut by the importation of Russians and other people right in this school. And we could go into details about this thing. This is what we're facing. So I'll finish the rest of it when we come back. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.